What if I told you that the greatest queen in English history, the untouchable, untamed, and untaken, Virgin Queen may not have been a queen at all, that for 45 years, the body that ruled an empire was not that of a woman, nor a man, nor something easily explained by any known category of medicine, biology, or theology, that when death finally came for her in the early hours of March the 24th, on of the year 1603, 3 witnesses uncovered a secret so monstrous, so destabilizing, that it was entombed in lead, bound in chains, and erased from every corner of official history, never to be spoken of again. And yet, fragments survived a hidden journal, a coded letter, a physician's trembling note in Latin, and a line scrawled in a Bible margin. I have seen proof that the devil can wear a crown. This is not a story about Elizabeth Tudor's reign. It is the story of her remains, and what they reveal beneath the powdered white mask, beneath the ruby-studded gowns and the myth of an immortal monarch untouched by time, was a body in violent collapse, decaying, corrupted, and reconfigured by decades of toxins, deforming beauty rituals, and a secret so unspeakable it may still rot beneath the marble tomb in Westminster Abbey. The history books will tell you she died peacefully in her sleep, after a brief illness, a glorious end to a golden reign. But the accounts that escape censorship, barely, speak of something else entirely: skin blackened and peeling, bones warped, organs displaced, and blood so thick and black it tarnished silver on contact. They whisper of anatomy that defied God's order, of a chest that pulsed where it should not, of genitalia neither fully male nor female, of a corpse so abnormal that it was wrapped in layers of cloth and lead before rigor mortis could even set in. To understand the horror that was revealed in death, we must first understand the performance of her life and the lengths to which Elizabeth went to keep her secret. From the age of 3, when she watched her mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded by her father, King Henry VIII, Elizabeth learned that the female body was a political liability, a tool of betrayal, and an object of state utility. She saw queens discarded like broken dolls when they failed to produce male heirs. She saw her half-sister Mary humiliated by false pregnancies and mocked as barren. From this blood-stained theatre of Tudor womanhood, Elizabeth crafted a new role, one never played before: the eternal virgin. A queen beholden to no man, a body untouched, a vessel only for power. But that body was no ordinary body. By the time Elizabeth took the throne in the year 1558, she had already begun transforming herself into a living symbol. Her face was daily caked with Venetian ceruse, a thick, white lead-based paste that symbolized purity, but seeped through her pores into her bones. Her waist was crushed by corsets, so tight they could crack ribs, displace livers, and turn internal organs to mush. Her hair was replaced with elaborate wigs to hide the clumps falling from her poisoned scalp. The pressure to appear immortal was not just cosmetic, it was existential. The mask had to remain intact, even as the flesh beneath began to disintegrate. And so the woman who became Gloriana, the icon, the warrior queen, the Protestant savior, was slowly being consumed by her own legend. By the end of the 1590s, her public appearances became less frequent, her presence increasingly theatrical, with servants dressing her for hours, propping her up, ensuring no one came too close. She refused to be seen without her full regalia. She ordered mirrors removed from her chambers. She began to speak with her hand over her mouth, to hide the black stubs that had once been teeth. Her skin blistered and oozed from infections caused by the dyes in her gowns and the pressure of whalebone corsets. Beneath the crown, her body was literally falling apart. Yet none of this compares to what happened after her death. According to the sanitized official account, Elizabeth died peacefully in Richmond Palace after refusing to go to bed for days. But the truth, pieced together from hidden correspondence and long-lost personal records, paints a very different picture. In her final hours, she suffered a seizure so violent that blood foamed from her mouth. Her body twisted into unnatural shapes, and her skin writhed as if something beneath it was still alive. When death finally took her, if it can be called death, her body was immediately seized, examined by only 3 people, and sealed from the world. No lying in state, no public viewing, no death mask, no official autopsy, just silence, and a vanishing trail of the few who saw too much. What they found beneath her gowns and makeup was not a monarch, but a monster. Fabric fused to flesh through years of infection. A corset embedded so deep, it peeled away pieces of her ribs. Internal organs blackened, twisted, and relocated by decades of damage. A skull softened by lead, with a pulsing soft spot where no adult should have one. Veins that ran black under translucent skin. A growth in her chest that bled tar-like fluid. And most damning of all, genitalia that confounded classification, suggesting ambiguous sexual development, or something more unearthly altogether. This was not just a decayed corpse, it was a ticking time bomb of scandal, heresy, and national trauma. If the Virgin Queen was not a woman, then what was she? If she had been hiding her true form for over 4 decades, then what else was a lie? Her gender, her virginity, her legitimacy, her very humanity. The implications were not just personal, they threatened to unravel the entire Protestant state she had built, and give enemies of England proof that the crown had been worn by something cursed, unnatural, even demonic. So the secret was buried, the lead casket sealed, the room scrubbed, the witnesses silenced, and Elizabeth became what she had always intended to be, a myth so powerful, so entrenched, that even her rotting, impossible body could not undo it. Her final victory was not over Spain or Rome, but over truth itself. For more than 4 centuries, the horror of what lay beneath the crown remained hidden. Until now, because the tomb is still there, the lead still sealed, the body still intact, and the truth, patient and terrible, waits beneath the stone. Before the corpse became legend, before the legend became statecraft, and before the statecraft consumed the flesh, there was a girl born of betrayal, of ambition, and of blood, who learned far too young that survival in the House of Tudor meant never being entirely real. The child who would become the most iconic monarch in English history was shaped not by privilege, but by trauma, so systemic, so surgically cold, that it did not merely break her, it reforged her into something other, something enduring, something untouchable. Elizabeth Tudor was born on the 7th of September, in the year 1533, in the opulent but unstable cradle of Greenwich Palace, to a father who prayed for a son, and a mother who would not live to see her daughter's 3rd birthday. The first lesson carved into Elizabeth's memory was that a woman's body, even a queen's, could be discarded like rotten silk if it failed to serve a purpose. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had risen like flame through the Tudor court, wielding wit, beauty, and ambition in equal measure. Yet her blaze ended at the executioner's block. Her neck snapped beneath a French sword in the spring of 1536, condemned for treason, adultery, and incest charges. Most historians now agree were fabricated to justify King Henry VIII's growing impatience and his need for a male heir. And so Elizabeth, not yet out of swaddling clothes, became the bastard daughter of a disgraced queen, a living reminder of royal shame. Growing up with the knowledge that her very existence had come at the cost of a woman's life. It was in this crucible of courtly cruelty that Elizabeth internalized her first and most fatal truth. To wear a woman's body in the Tudor world was to stand at the edge of a blade, where beauty was currency, Fertility was expectation, and any failure, any flaw, was a death sentence waiting to be signed in ink and blood. She watched her father treat marriage like a butcher's ledger. 6 wives, reduced to cautionary tales, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, each one a warning. She observed how her half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was paraded as the rightful heir and then locked away, declared illegitimate when Henry changed his mind. She witnessed how Mary's identity crumbled under the weight of political pressure and spiritual anguish. Her phantom pregnancies mocked, her mind unraveling. The message was inescapable. A woman in power must become more than flesh, or be devoured by it. Elizabeth, even as a child, refused to be devoured. It was not just cleverness that made her dangerous. It was her decision to weaponize the very thing that had destroyed her mother, the body. From adolescence, she understood that to survive, she must construct herself into an ideal so complete, so rigid, and so untouchable, that no man, no priest, no courtier could ever pry beneath it. And so began the lifelong performance, the construction of the Virgin Queen. What began as self-protection soon became state policy. By the time she was crowned at the age of 25, Elizabeth was no longer just a person. She was a symbol carved in alabaster, a mask painted in lead, a body draped in iconography. The girl had vanished beneath the crown. But masks, no matter how masterfully crafted, exact a price from the flesh beneath. The transformation was not metaphorical. Elizabeth's body was not merely dressed. It was sculpted, molded, and eventually mutilated in the service of image. Her makeup, famously white and luminous, was made of Venetian ceruse, a deadly compound of white lead and vinegar. It was applied in layers so thick it resembled plaster, covering every blemish, erasing every trace of blood and humanity from her face, until what remained was not skin but porcelain. This was not vanity. It was armor. The whiteness symbolized virginity, divine favor, incorruptibility, qualities necessary for a woman who ruled alone in a world of men. For a Protestant queen standing as the last wall against Catholic Europe. But the lead did not stay on the surface. It seeped through her pores, entered her bloodstream, and began the long, irreversible process of poisoning her from the inside out. Alongside the makeup came the corsets, monstrous constructions of whalebone, iron, and steel, bound so tightly around her torso that her ladies-in-waiting had to brace their feet against her back to cinch them closed. The pressure exerted by these devices exceeded 80 pounds per square inch, enough to crack ribs, compress lungs, and deform internal organs. She wore them up to 16 hours a day, every day. For over 4 decades, they forced her into the silhouette of eternal youth, a narrow waist, a high bust, a straight posture, an image that suggested strength without sensuality, femininity without vulnerability. But the cost was unimaginable. Her liver was displaced upward into her ribcage. Her stomach was compressed to a fraction of its natural size. Her spine twisted. Her lower ribs buckled inward. Each breath became laborious. Each meal a gamble against vomiting or intestinal collapse. But none of it could be abandoned, not if the illusion was to hold. And then there was the hair, as lead and mercury corroded her scalp. Elizabeth's once vibrant red hair began to fall out in tufts, forcing her to adopt increasingly elaborate wigs that, like her gowns, grew more ornate, more ceremonial, and more suffocating with each passing year. Her wigs were not simply hairpieces, they were thrones perched on her skull, symbolic crowns in their own right, towering constructions of horsehair and wire, often adorned with pearls, gold thread, and false braids. Beneath them, her scalp festered in secret, hidden beneath powders meant to dry the wounds. which only exacerbated the bleeding. By her mid-30s, Elizabeth had all but disappeared beneath her image. The court no longer addressed her as a woman, but as a goddess, a celestial body, a marble statue brought to life by divine providence. She encouraged this. She signed portraits as Gloriana, Estrella, and the Virgin Queen. She spoke of marriage as unnecessary, of her body as belonging to England. But behind the closed doors of her private chambers, letters reveal the desperation of someone whose flesh was turning against her. There are accounts of feverish rages when a mirror was accidentally left in her room. Servants were dismissed for touching her too familiarly. Physicians were permitted to examine her only from the neck up. The lower body, where the truth may have been most visible, was absolutely forbidden. There are also cryptic remarks from Elizabeth herself. In her early 30s, when Parliament pushed her most aggressively to marry, she replied with a line that has baffled historians for centuries. "I have within me a great impediment, known only to God." Was she referring to trauma, a deformity, or something even stranger? Was it metaphor or confession? What is certain is that the mask was no longer optional. It had become a prison. The longer Elizabeth lived, the more rigorously the illusion had to be maintained, until every public appearance became a theatrical production of painted flesh, iron-bound organs, and forced smiles. Her inner circle learned the choreography well. No one questioned the hours of preparation before she emerged. No one commented on the stench of ointments and herbs. No one flinched when she leaned against walls for support or clutched a chair to keep from collapsing. She was the queen not merely of England, but of illusion. By the time the 1590s arrived, Elizabeth was nearly 60 years old, though her portrait still showed a radiant woman of 30. She had become a living contradiction, a monarch who ruled through strength but whose body was rotting, a virgin who may never have been sexually whole, a symbol of purity whose blood was tainted with metal, whose bones had been rearranged to serve an ideal. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the state, to myth, to the idea of England, and she played her part flawlessly. But flesh does not forget, and poison keeps its ledger. The mask would hold for a few more years. Then it would begin to crack, and beneath it, the world would glimpse what Elizabeth had hidden all her life, not just the ravages of age, but something far more terrifying, something not entirely human. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to romanticize royalty from the comfort of centuries later, to picture a queen seated beneath stained glass windows, golden embroidery flowing from her shoulders, a glimmering diadem resting on artfully coiled hair. It is harder and far less comforting to remember that those same symbols of power, the crown, the rouge, the gown, the bone-crushing corset, can also be instruments of destruction. In Elizabeth Tudor's case, they were not merely symbols, nor even burdens. They were poisons, and they killed her slowly, from the inside out, with a patience that only royal legacy could sustain. What the sword had done to her mother swiftly, the crown did to Elizabeth over the course of 44 long and rotting years. By the year 1570, Elizabeth had become inseparable from her own iconography. She was no longer a woman who wore white lead makeup. She was the white mask itself. Venetian ceruse, the so-called paint of queens, was a cosmetic made from powdered white lead, mixed with vinegar and egg whites, giving the skin an ethereal, ghost-like pallor. It concealed every imperfection, every blemish, every scar, but it also penetrated the pores, infiltrated the blood, and began the silent work of systemic destruction. Lead, in small doses, accumulates. In large doses, it annihilates. Elizabeth applied this mask not as ornament, but as necessity. Her skin, under the corrosive weight of courtly expectation and state performance, began to break down. The first signs were subtle redness, then irritation, then boils that wept. so she applied more makeup. And when that irritated the skin further, she added mercury-based salves to treat the inflammation. But mercury, too, is a killer, especially when applied daily. The pain increased, the skin thinned, the blood grew toxic, and yet the mask remained. Because it had to. Because to appear with a flawed face was to appear vulnerable, and Elizabeth had long ago decided she would never again be vulnerable. This was not vanity. It was statecraft. In a world where femininity was seen as a liability and power as inherently male, Elizabeth's face was her fortress. It declared her virginity to her godliness. Her inaccessibility. The pale mask was not makeup. It was propaganda in lead form. It whispered that she was untainted by sin, unclaimed by man, uncorrupted by time. But in private, it cost her everything. The consequences were not merely dermatological. Over time, the lead destroyed the tissues of her mouth and gums. Her teeth blackened, loosened, and eventually fell out, one by one, until she had to speak with a hand covering her mouth. Court portraits continued to show her with ruby lips and a coy smile. But behind the paint, her gums were ulcerated, her tongue inflamed, her breath sour with infection. She began to limit her speech in public. Her words, when they came, were slow, deliberate, chosen with care because speaking too quickly risked revealing the ruin within. Her hair, once famously red like her mother's, had long since begun falling out in handfuls. By her 40th year, it had thinned into sparse, lifeless strands. In response, she commissioned wigs, elaborate structures of horsehair and human hair, dusted with white powder to match her complexion. But these wigs suffocated her scalp, exacerbating sores and causing fungal infections. Beneath the royal coif, her skull was a battlefield of lesions, scabs, and raw skin. Every morning, she endured hours of preparation, layers of creams to seal the wounds, more powder to soak the moisture, and finally the crown of hair itself, pinned tightly into place. By the end of the day, her head throbbed with pain beneath the weight of the disguise. And still it was not enough. Her neck, chest, arms, and hands, any visible flesh were painted as well. Her clothing, dyed with toxic pigments including arsenic and copper-based greens, caused rashes and inflammation where it pressed against her already fragile skin. She wore ruffs so tight they restricted blood flow, gowns with iron stays that rubbed against exposed wounds, and gloves infused with perfumes, so acidic they burned into the webbing between her fingers. Even her jewelry was not free of harm. Many stones were mounted with lead soda, which leached into open wounds as they scraped across her poisoned skin. But no torture matched that of the corset. The Elizabethan corset was not the hourglass-shaping fashion piece modern audiences might imagine. It was a punitive device. Her bodices were reinforced with whalebone, iron rods, and oak strips, laced tighter than any physician would dare recommend. Each morning, her ladies would tighten the cords until Elizabeth's waist shrank unnaturally, her ribs folded inward, and her lungs compressed to the point of shallow, panting breath. It was not unusual for her to faint during dressing. Sometimes, she was revived with rose water. Other times, she was left in silence until her breath returned. This was the daily ritual of a monarch whose public image had to remain flawless. But the internal toll was catastrophic. Her ribs cracked and refused in unnatural positions. Her stomach shifted upward, pressing against her diaphragm. Her liver twisted beneath the weight of her own bones. Over decades, this bodily architecture became permanent. When physicians in later years pressed against her abdomen, they found organs where none should be. Her heart beat not just from her chest, but from her side. Her breathing came in irregular hisses. She could no longer sleep lying flat, for her lungs could not expand in that position. And yet every morning, the corset returned. The layers of deception grew heavier with each passing year, and with them, the psychological cost. By the time Elizabeth entered her 6th decade, the mask was not merely painful, it was unbearable. Her nerves, ravaged by metal toxicity, fired with phantom pain. Her balance deteriorated. Her hands trembled. She began to experience visual hallucinations. Servants whispered of nights when she spoke to ghosts, to of shadows dancing on her skin, as if something beneath it moved independently. When her physicians treated her for sleeplessness, they did not call it madness. They called it queenly distemper. But in truth, Elizabeth's mind was unraveling as surely as her body. Still, she refused to appear weak. When foreign ambassadors were admitted to court, they were kept at careful distances, no closer than 6 feet. When artists painted her, they were forbidden to see her without her cosmetics. When illness confined her to her bed, a stand-in dressed in her gown, wig, and mask would appear at the window, waving to the people. She became a living myth, preserved in distance and illusion, and those closest to her, knowing full well the price of truth, helped her maintain the charade. No mirror was allowed in her presence. Her bedchamber was lit only by filtered light. No one was permitted to touch her skin unless gloved. When food was served, it was cut into the smallest possible pieces, for chewing had become an agony. When she bled, which was often, her blood came black and viscous, thick with toxins, foul-smelling. She joked, once, that she was made of ink and iron, but no one laughed. The most bitter irony was this: the very substances meant to preserve her beauty, to sustain the illusion of immortality, were the instruments of her decay. The lead corroded her brain, weakening memory and inducing paranoia. The mercury inflamed her nerves and blackened her mood. The arsenic ate her skin from within. The corset crushed her organs. And the lie that she was incorruptible demanded more makeup, more restriction, more sacrifice. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth was no longer living in her body. She was haunting it. Her days were orchestrated marionette performances. Her nights were drenched in pain, fever, and silence. And yet she clung to the mask, because by then, it was all she had left. To remove it would be to admit weakness, mortality, failure, and for the woman who had built an empire on the altar of self-denial, there could be no higher blasphemy. The poison crown had become her throne, her cage, and her final testament, and though her skin peeled, her bones cracked, and her voice faltered, the world continued to believe in the mask, because it had to, because if they ever saw what lay beneath, they would have to admit the truth, that the queen they revered had already begun to die. By the final decade of her reign, the Queen of England no longer walked among her people as a sovereign of flesh and spirit, but as a carefully orchestrated illusion, a figure rehearsed, constructed, and choreographed so thoroughly that not even her closest attendants could discern where the woman ended and the performance began. Elizabeth Tudor, once radiant with wit and political fire, had been reduced to the centerpiece of a morbid stage play in which every detail was pre-scripted, every entrance rehearsed, and every inch of visible skin painted, propped, or padded into submission. This was no longer governance, it was spectacle, not sovereignty, but shadow play, not rule, but survival masquerading as ceremony. The court had long understood that their monarch demanded a certain distance, but in these final years, the distance became abyssal. The Queen's public appearances became increasingly rare and brief, always preceded by hours, sometimes 4 or more of meticulous preparation. Her face, raw from decades of corrosive cosmetics, had to be coated in ever thicker layers of lead paste, which now cracked almost immediately upon drying. Her hairpieces, now towering constructions of false curls and wire supports, were necessary to conceal the bleeding sores on her scalp and the complete absence of natural hair beneath. Her body, twisted and reshaped by corsets worn for over 40 years, required custom-built gowns with hidden slits and adjustable panels to accommodate swelling limbs, weeping ulcers, and a belly bloated by either tumor, organ displacement, or something more terrible altogether. She was no longer dressing to impress, she was dressing to contain. Witnesses from foreign courts, once dazzled by the Queen's pageantry, now returned with disturbing stories, delivered in hushed tones and veiled language. A Venetian diplomat, having caught a glimpse of her without full regalia, confessed that the sight gave him nightmares for weeks. Her face, he wrote, was greyish-blue, deeply furrowed, and perforated by abscesses like the surface of the moon, and her eyes, once hawk-like and bright, seemed clouded, darting, unfocused, as though searching for something only she could see. And still, the play continued. Elizabeth insisted on maintaining her image as a divine figure untouched by age or disease, even as her body betrayed her with increasing regularity. In the year 1593, after a particularly violent illness, possibly a stroke, or a lead-induced seizure, she began experiencing what her physicians cautiously referred to as phantasmic episodes. She would hold conversations with empty spaces, referring to long-dead courtiers as if they stood before her, reaching for the air with trembling hands, whispering apologies to a mother she had never truly known. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence, eyes fixed on something behind her listeners, and remain frozen there for long minutes, utterly still, except for the silent movement of her lips. The Privy Council, desperate to preserve the illusion of stability, devised an increasingly elaborate system of doubles. Women of similar stature, tall, slender, broad-shouldered, were selected, fitted with custom gowns and wigs, and trained to mimic the Queen's posture and gestures from a balcony, a shadowed corridor, or behind a gauze curtain. These women would stand in for her when she was too ill, too delirious, or too decayed to be seen. At a distance, none could tell the difference. The illusion held, for a while, her voice, once commanding enough to silence entire courtrooms with a single phrase, had begun to waver. It emerged now as a strained, breathless rasp, thin, broken by pauses, and increasingly slurred. Her left hand trembled when she held documents, forcing her to switch to her right, which caused even more suspicion among those who watched carefully. Her gait, once regal and fluid, had been reduced to short, shuffling steps. She could no longer climb stairs unassisted, and in her own apartments, ramps were discreetly installed behind tapestries to ease her movements. Her food was carefully softened, as chewing had become impossible, and she ate little too little. Beneath the padded bodices and wide skirts, her body was wasting away. There were rumours among the ladies in waiting of a putrid smell that lingered wherever the Queen sat too long, of sheets stained with black discharge, of blood-coloured bile vomited into golden bowls and quickly whisked away by silent servants. Physicians rotated through her chambers, applying salves and tinctures, draining abscesses, and bleeding her in a vain attempt to remove what they called corruptions of the blood. One physician, writing in Latin, described a monstrum in corpore, a growth near her left breast that throbbed of its own accord, dark purple, with veins that pulsed independently. When lanced, it released a substance, neither pus nor blood, but something viscous, metallic in odour, and warm as life itself. He confessed in a private note that the growth seemed almost sentient, and still she refused to surrender the stage. Mirrors were forbidden entirely. Not even the glint of polished silver was allowed in her presence. She had no desire to confront what the world might see if they looked too closely. She insisted on being surrounded by perfumed herbs, lavender, rosemary, juniper, not merely to soothe her nerves, but to cover the scent of rot. Her courtiers were instructed never to kneel too close, never to touch her skin, never to make eye contact for longer than a moment. They obeyed, because to break the rules was to be dismissed. Or worse, by the winter of 1598, Elizabeth no longer permitted herself to sit for portraits. The painters were instead instructed to reuse earlier compositions, merely altering the clothes or background. Some used sketches made Thecker's prior. Others worked from written descriptions sent by her chief attendants. None saw her in person. The result was a visual record preserved in myth, a queen ageless, fearless, immortal, while the real woman decayed in her chambers like a forgotten relic. Behind the closed doors of her private apartments, the rituals of the mask became desperate. Her ladies no longer prepared her body, they maintained it like a fragile relic. The corsets had to be padded internally to prevent bone from piercing through skin. The garments had hidden compartments for cloths soaked in balm, strategically placed to catch oozing sores. Each movement was choreographed to avoid tearing the flesh, which had become paper-thin. The Queen's chair had been redesigned with a removable seat to accommodate her inability to control certain bodily functions. Though this was never spoken of aloud, she refused rest. There were nights when she would stand in one position for hours, staring at a single candle, whispering that if she sat, death would come for her. Her ladies, exhausted, begged her to lie down. She refused, and when they finally convinced her to recline, she would jolt awake minutes later, eyes wide with terror, gasping that something had entered the room, something cold. With wings, her sleep became fractured, haunted, and eventually impossible. The physicians called it melancholia. Others feared it was madness. Still others whispered what no one dared say, that the Queen's body, already past death, was being held together only by the sheer force of her will. In those final months, Elizabeth became both monarch and marionette, a puppet wrapped in cloth and legend, her strings pulled by the necessities of state, by the fear of instability, by the terror of revealing what had long been hidden. When she appeared in public, she was held upright between two trusted ladies, their hands discreetly gripping her elbows beneath her sleeves. When she spoke, it was in fragments, recited like lines from a fading play. When she smiled, it was with lips drawn back from blackened gums, the teeth long since replaced with wax and ivory. And yet the court cheered. They bowed. They praised the immortal Gloriana, because the performance had to go on, because if it stopped, everything would collapse. It was not the Queen they were applauding. It was the lie. A lie so old it had become a religion. A lie so necessary it had become a nation. But a body, no matter how royal, can only be staged for so long. And as winter melted into the early spring of 1603, the curtain began to tear. The sores no longer healed. The blood came more frequently. The puppet could no longer stand. And the final act was about to begin. It began with a swelling. At first, her physicians called it a minor inflammation, a simple congestion of humours brought on by exhaustion, age, and grief. But the growth near Elizabeth's left breast was not like the others. It was not soft or passive. It pulsed. It throbbed. It grew warm beneath the skin, changing in shape and temperament as though alive. The Queen, by then unable to lie flat for more than a few moments, refused to let anyone near it. She barked at the physicians, cursed them in Latin, and held her thin arm over her chest, like a dying bird guarding its nest. But the pain became unbearable. When the abscess ruptured during an attempted dressing, The women attending her recoiled in horror, not from the blood, but from the black sludge that poured out in slow, bubbling streams. It was not pus. It was not clotted blood. It was something else, something viscous, metallic in scent, and warm like freshly spilled ink. The court physician on duty, a man named Richard Manningham, insisted upon lancing the growth fully. It took him over half an hour to convince the Queen, and only after she was so weak from fever that she stopped resisting. What he uncovered beneath her skin would haunt him for the rest of his short, silenced life. The mass, dark purple in hue, was the size of a goose egg, and threaded with veins that twisted like roots into her ribcage. When he pierced its deepest pocket, something hard clicked against the scalpel. At first, he assumed it was calcification, but then it moved, and when he extracted it, his hands trembling as he held the forceps aloft, he found not bone but a small, curved tooth, then another, and then a clump of tangled red-brown hair. It was a teratoma, or at least, that was the closest word medicine could offer for what they found. A growth that imitated life, formed of teeth, hair, and fragments of tissue, but neither benign nor truly separate from the woman in whom it lived. In modern parlance, it might be described as a parasitic twin or a monstrous tumour. But for Elizabeth's court in the year 1603, it was nothing short of abomination, a sign not just of disease, but of divine punishment, a corruption too grotesque to be seen, too dangerous to be spoken. From that moment, the whispers began again, not about illness or age, but about unnatural birth, about monstrous creation, about what Elizabeth truly was beneath her mask of divinity and her veil of Protestant glory. Lady Helena von Snakenborg, one of the Queen's most trusted attendants, wrote in an encrypted journal that she had seen something not of Eve's kind, nor of Adam's rib, but of another arrangement entirely, like unto a sculpture begun and then abandoned mid-creation. And yet, this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Queen's decline accelerated into horror. Her throat developed lesions that made swallowing nearly impossible. Her weight dropped so drastically that her bones could be seen shifting beneath her skin like machinery beneath a torn canvas. But it was her skin itself that alarmed her attendants most. It began to darken not evenly, but in strange, branching patterns, black veins, rising like rivers from beneath the surface. In some places, the skin blistered and peeled, revealing raw pink tissue that refused to clot. In others, it grew thick and scaly, with textures likened to barnacles or hardened bark. Along her spine, beneath layers of linen and padded garments, lumps began to emerge, bony protrusions that forced her to sleep half-seated, half-hanging, unable to rest without pressure against them. When one burst open beneath the weight of a corset, it revealed a twisted knot of cartilage, and beneath that, a growth that resembled the beginnings of a horn. Her ladies wept in silence. The priests, when summoned, fumbled their prayers. The Queen, however, said nothing. She refused last rites. She forbade the word death from being spoken in her presence. And when her council asked if she wished to name a successor, she replied, "There is no end. Not for me. I am still the body of England." But the body of England had begun to rot. The ulcers on her legs, first described as minor bruises, had become cavernous pits, leaking foul-smelling discharge. The stench was so unbearable that herbs had to be burned continuously in her chambers, and those who entered were instructed to cover their mouths and noses with linen soaked in vinegar. These were not wounds caused by pressure or age. They were signs of systemic collapse. The skin, already weakened by decades of toxic cosmetic use, could no longer regenerate. Beneath the surface, the blood was no longer red. but thick and tar-black, sticky as molasses and stinking of metal. When it touched silver instruments, they tarnished within seconds. Manningham described it as the blood of no known species. As the physical body unraveled, Elizabeth's mind followed. She spoke less and less, and when she did, her words came in fragments, often in languages no one recognized. She sometimes hummed to herself for hours, or scratched invisible patterns into the arms of her chair. In her final coherent conversation with Robert Cecil, she whispered, "I am tied with a chain of iron about my neck. The case is altered with me." Whether she meant the burden of power or the prison of her own body, no one could say, but those who prepared her for death would learn the truth. When she finally collapsed on March the 23rd, her body convulsed for nearly an hour, foam and blood pouring from her mouth, her limbs seizing with such force that 2 attendants broke fingers trying to hold her down. Then she fell silent. Her chest rose, unseen, twice, then stopped. Death was recorded at 3 o'clock in the morning, March the 24th, but what happened after that moment would be erased from all official records. Her corpse, still warm, was immediately taken into isolation. Only 3 were permitted to touch it: Dr. Manningham, Lady Helena von Snakenborg, and an unnamed Anglican minister. The room was sealed, the windows blacked out, and when they began to undress her, the true extent of her transformation became impossible to deny. The corset had fused to her flesh, dried blood, acting as glue between garment and skin. When removed, it pulled away strips of tissue, revealing a rib cage permanently collapsed inward. Hair liver, when located, was found in the upper chest cavity, shriveled and black. Her stomach was compressed to the size of a clenched fist. The lungs were spongy and irregular, but it was the reproductive anatomy that silenced the room. Where there should have been clarity, there was ambiguity. The external genitalia were not fully formed, neither male nor female, but a fusion of both, overlaid with ancient scar tissue. The vaginal canal was sealed shut, as though never opened. The uterus, what little could be found of it, was shriveled and calcified, and most disturbing of all, deep within the abdominal cavity, there appeared to be a second heart smaller than the first, but complete, beating no more, yet intact, with veins that once carried blood. A second heart, in the body of a queen, and somewhere behind her eye socket, a small, spherical growth was discovered when cut open. It released a clear fluid, and a cluster of white pearls, no larger than seeds. Were they cysts? Eggs? No one knew. No one dared to ask. The 3 witnesses exchanged no words. They finished the work in silence. The body was wrapped in starched cloth, soaked in resin, placed in a lead coffin, sealed shut, then placed inside a second vessel, lined with mercury and encircled by iron chains etched with Latin prayers. They were sworn to silence. Manningham was sent north under a new name. Helena entered a convent. The minister disappeared. The chamber was stripped. The bedding burned. The floor replaced. Nothing would remain, because what they had seen was not a queen. It was a monster, a being that had outlived its body, defied its gender, and worn the crown of England while hiding in plain sight beneath paint, lace, and silence. A creature not born of sin, nor nature, nor miracle but of power. The terrifying cost of myth made flesh, and what they buried that night beneath Westminster Abbey was not merely a monarch. It was a secret, still sealed, still waiting. They knew before she drew her final breath that her death could not be handled like any other sovereign's. There would be no lying in state, no public mourning chamber, not death mask, no open casket, because what lay beneath Elizabeth Tudor's royal robes was not a monarch fit for memory. but a grotesque truth, so incendiary, it threatened to incinerate the legitimacy of an entire empire. The Privy Council did not merely grieve the loss of a queen they feared, the collapse of the myth that had held the English crown aloft for nearly half a century. And so, in the hours immediately following her final shuddering exhalation, they made a decision that would echo through 4 centuries. The body of Elizabeth would not be remembered. It would be buried in lead, in silence, and in lies. By 3 o'clock in the morning, on March the 24th of the year 1603, her body was stripped and examined in secret. What the 3 witnesses saw was never officially recorded, yet each would vanish from public life. Within weeks of the Queen's burial, what they found: bones warped by corsetry, organs twisted and blackened by poison, genitalia ambiguous and sealed, a second heart, skin eaten away by lead, hair growing from tumours. Blood that moved like oil and tarnished metal was not just a medical curiosity, it was a spiritual threat, a political weapon waiting to be wielded, a prophecy fulfilled not by divinity, but by decay. The silence began that very night. The Queen's corpse, still warm, was wrapped in sarloth, a heavy linen treated with oils and resins and bound so tightly that flesh and cloth became one. No embalming was performed. There was no need. The process was not to preserve her body, but to conceal it. A coffin of solid lead was ordered, not 1, but 2, each constructed with urgent haste, double-lined, soldered shut while the corpse was still pliable. Between the layers, mercury was poured, its silver weight pressing against the Queen's remains like a liquid veil. Iron chains, thick as a man's wrist, were wrapped around the inner casket, etched with Latin inscriptions meant not only for protection, but perhaps for warning. No royal burial before or since had ever involved such rituals. No artists were summoned to render her final likeness. No public physician signed a death certificate. No sermon addressed the physical loss. The only official record stated that the Queen died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by dignity, her passing quiet and holy. But the inner circle knew better, and they knew that the preservation of the nation now rested not on celebrating her death, but on erasing it entirely. The 3 witnesses were separated within 24 hours. Dr. Richard Manningham was given a generous pension, but his name disappeared from royal medical records by the end of the month. A letter later discovered in the archives of a Scottish monastery placed him north of Edinburgh under an assumed name, living alone, visited only by a single courier every few weeks. He died 5 years later. No autopsy was performed. His journals were burned by order of the Crown. Lady Helena von Snakenborg, once chief gentlewoman of the bedchamber, vanished into a convent in northern France, under the protection of a powerful noble family. Though she had once attended every royal function, her name was stricken from court rolls, and her portraits removed from Whitehall. Decades later, a ciphered document bearing her seal was found in the archives of the convent. It read only, "She wore a woman's face," but that which lay beneath was not meant for daylight. The 3rd witness, an unnamed Anglican minister thought to be present at the sealing of the coffin, vanished without a trace. His last known possession, a King James Bible, was found in a cathedral archive 2 centuries later. Inside, a single note written in a shaking hand had been wedged behind Psalm 51. "I have seen proof that the devil may wear a crown. May God forgive me for what I did not say." Their silence was enforced not only by royal command, but by the brutal efficiency of a frightened state. Every piece of linen that had touched the Queen's body was burned. The bed on which she died was dismantled, the draperies removed. The floorboards beneath her deathbed were torn up and replaced. Servants who had been present during her final hours were reassigned to distant posts or given sudden pensions to live far from London. Their accounts were seized. Some were threatened. Others were never heard from again. Even the architecture of her burial was redesigned to suit the cover-up. Elizabeth's tomb in Westminster Abbey was constructed with deliberate irregularities. Ground-penetrating radar centuries later would reveal voids, unexplained chambers, and a second shell of lead encasing the original coffin. No other monarch in English history has ever been entombed with such security, and while other kings and queens have had their remains examined, reinterred, or relocated in subsequent centuries, Elizabeth's has remained untouched, not once opened, not once confirmed, not once disturbed. Why? Because the risk was not in disturbing her bones. The risk was in confirming the lie. Immediately after her burial, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland. Now, James I of England. His succession was unusually smooth, almost suspiciously. So, given the decades of conflict between Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, within his first year of rule, James ordered the destruction of numerous documents from Elizabeth's reign, including private correspondences, medical records, and certain classified inventories from the royal wardrobe. Payments were issued to tailors and craftsmen without explanation, and several unique items of clothing were burned or sent to foreign embassies as gifts, but were never confirmed to have arrived. James also issued a quiet order forbidding any future examination of Elizabeth's remains under any circumstance. The stated reason was royal sanctity and peace for the dead, but no such order was issued for his own mother Mary, Queen of Scots, whose body had been moved, opened, and reburied. Nor was it issued for Henry VIII, whose tomb had been looted and examined. Only Elizabeth's coffin remains inviolable, untouched, and shrouded in layers of iron, mercury, and silence. There were those within the church who questioned the strangeness of the burial. Why had there been no public procession? Why no embalming? Why no state display? The Archbishop of Canterbury at the time reportedly refused to deliver the official funeral rites in person. A bishop of lesser rank performed the ceremony. The Queen's body was not viewed, nor were any mourners permitted to enter the chamber where she lay. The coffin was brought directly from the sealed death room to the chapel, covered in black velvet and flanked by guards who had never seen her alive. It was lowered into the vault, without a single family member touching it. What were they protecting? Or rather, what were they hiding? In the decades that followed, the truth became legend. The few who remembered whispered of strange deformities, of sealed anatomy, of a queen who never allowed herself to be touched below the neck, of the enormous expenses paid for physicians who were never named, of tailors who sewed gowns for a changing body, whose changes no one dared to describe. The most enduring rumor was that Elizabeth had been born intersex, or that she had been replaced in childhood by a male actor trained to maintain the image of a virgin queen. The so-called Bisley Boy legend, often dismissed as folk nonsense, gained new relevance in the light of the sealed tomb. The destroyed records, and the anatomical reports that slipped through the cracks of censorship. What if, it asked, Elizabeth had never been entirely who or what she claimed to be? What if the Tudor legacy rested on a lie, but no one dared push further? The British monarchy, the Anglican Church, and the foundations of empire were too deeply entangled with her legacy. She was Gloriana. She was the mother of England. She was the light that never dimmed. To question her was to question the divine order of power. To disturb her rest was to risk revealing the corpse that had lied to a nation. And so she remains, buried in Westminster Abbey, entombed in lead, mercury, iron, and myth, surrounded by the silence of those who knew too much. Her epitaph reads consorts both in throne and grave, but her grave contains only her, and within her, perhaps not a queen, not a woman, not a man, but something else entirely. Something England could never afford to name. There are secrets so strange that they cannot be absorbed through reason, so repulsive that even the most rational minds recoil from their implications. Elizabeth Tudor's body, once so carefully sculpted into a symbol of purity, divinity, and permanence, did not merely fail to conform to the expectations of royalty or womanhood, it failed to conform to nature itself. The Queen, who ruled with a mask of eternal youth and authority, died as something no physician could name, no church could absolve, and no history could contain. Her corpse was not just diseased, it was impossible. The three who examined her Manningham, Snakenborg, and the unnamed cleric entered that chamber, expecting to find rot, perhaps corruption, perhaps the grotesqueries of age. But what they encountered was a catalogue of anatomical contradictions, a body assembled not by evolution, but by the trauma of concealment, mutation, and perhaps something older, something darker, for what lay beneath the layers of silk, lead, and statecraft was not simply a woman undone by cosmetics or corsets, but a being whose interior architecture spoke of years, decades of poisoning, deformation, concealment, and adaptation, until what remained bore only the faintest resemblance to the species that had once crowned her sovereign. The first horror was her blood. It did not flow. It oozed, black, viscous, and heavy, with a metallic sheen that shimmered beneath candlelight. It clung to surgical instruments like oil and smelled of iron and rot, but with an undercurrent of something unnatural sweetness mixed with decay, like spoiled wine or decaying flowers. When it touched silver, it turned it black. When it touched gold, it left no trace. And when it dripped to the stone floor, it pooled without spreading, forming perfect circles, as if obeying a will of its own. Manningham, in his later writings, scribbled in cipher and hidden between the pages of medical texts, described the blood as unliving ink, as though it had been designed not to nourish flesh, but to preserve the idea of it. Then came the heart, or rather, hearts. Within the Queen's chest cavity, nestled behind the breastbone, was the expected organ, though it was shriveled, hardened, and discoloured, the arteries around it stiff with plaque and lead deposits, but below it, toward the lower sternum, the surgeons found a second mass, pulsatile and encapsulated, roughly the size of a walnut. When dissected, it revealed chambers, valves, veins, a second heart, smaller, but complete, embedded in muscle that seemed to resist decay. No explanation was offered in any medical text. Manningham, who was trained in both Galenic and emerging anatomical traditions, wrote, "Only God does not make this twice." The lungs were asymmetrical. The left one bloated and mottled with lesions, the right one shriveled and dark. But beneath them, in the abdominal cavity, lay another mystery pockets of lung tissue, floating, unconnected, as though they had been displaced by force or grown anew. The liver was split down the middle, one half fibrotic and fossilized, the other strangely soft, riddled with calcified nodes that resembled pearls. Her intestines had fused in places, wound tight around organs that were no longer where they belonged. The uterus, or what remained of it, was withered and sealed shut, its walls lined with scar tissue that had hardened into a shell. The vaginal canal was non-existent, either never formed or surgically removed and sewn with ancient care, and the external anatomy, ambiguous, hybridized, disturbingly indeterminate. The skin in that region was thick and grey, with folds resembling both labia and the early formation of a scrotal sac. No clear urethra was found. No cervix, only a blind, sealed surface of skin and scar. The skeletal system revealed even more anomalies. The ribcage had been crushed and reshaped by decades of corsetry. The bones fused in unnatural curves, some of which had grown sharp spurs that protruded inward toward the organs. The spine, once upright and commanding, had twisted into an shape, compressing the vertebrae and pinching nerves. Yet more disturbing were the protrusions, bony growths emerging between the vertebrae horn-like structures. 3 of them, symmetrical, pointed, covered in a thick, scale-like skin. They seem to have once been sensitive to pressure. When sliced open, they revealed marrow. This was not arthritis. This was not cancer. This was something else. A kind of skeletal rebellion. A body pushing outward, growing defense or expression or identity where none should exist. At the base of the skull, the occipital bone bulged outward, forming a soft spot that had never fully calcified. In infants, this is called the fontanelle, a place where the skull remains open to allow brain growth. In adults, it should be fused. In Elizabeth's case, it pulsed gently, even post-mortem, and when incised, a clear gelatinous fluid spilled out, followed by a cluster of pale nodules. When bisected, each contained filaments that resembled nerve fibers. What was the brain? Then Manningham described it as dry and dense. The outer cortex blackened with lead deposits. The inner folds hardened like tree bark. Embedded within it were 3 small stones, no larger than peas, opaque and white, with veins running through them. When sliced, they gave off a sharp, chemical odor. They were not tumors. They were not cysts. No one could identify them. This was not the corpse of a woman destroyed by time. It was a creature consumed by transformation, whether by design, necessity, or punishment. No one could say. Snakenborg is said to have fainted when the final layers of the body were uncovered. The cleric refused to write anything down, speaking only once, as they wrapped the corpse in oil-soaked cloth. This is not Adam's daughter. They did not embalm her. They did not wash her. They bound the body in layer after layer of resin-soaked linen, wrapped it in iron chain, placed it into a lead coffin that was itself placed into a second shell, lined with mercury and soldered shut with molten silver. Her tomb was sealed, not blessed. No holy water touched her skin. No bishop laid a hand on her brow. No bell tolled. No eyes saw her again. What they had discovered could not be named, because naming it would have required language that had no place in Christendom. To admit what they had seen would not only invalidate Elizabeth's reign, it would shake the foundations of human understanding. It would force the Crown to admit that the icon of Protestant purity, the slayer of the Spanish Armada, the mother of empire, had not been a virgin queen or even a woman, but something altogether different. A sovereign whose flesh did not obey the laws of God or man. In the centuries that followed, fragments of the truth bled into rumour, then myth, then legend, the Bisley Boy theory, the whispers of intersex birth, the strange silence of the Catholic Church after her death, the refusal to exhume her, the political violence that followed, but none of them capture the sheer strangeness of what her body contained. Because Elizabeth did not die as a woman, she did not even die as a monarch. She died as a riddle, one that no scientist, theologian, or historian has yet solved. What is a person whose blood poisons silver? What is a sovereign with 2 hearts? What is a body that sprouts bone and hides teeth in tumours? And if such a being ruled England for 45 years, what, then, was England? What does a nation do when it realises its monarch was never what they seemed to be? What choice is left when the sovereign body, the holy vessel through which divine right flows, is revealed to be neither holy, nor human, nor right in any recognisable sense? In the dark hours following Elizabeth Tudor's death, as 3 witnesses stood trembling beside a corpse that challenged the very definition of creation, a single, unspoken conclusion was reached. If the truth were known, the Crown itself would collapse. It would not be a scandal. It would be an extinction. And so, they buried her. But more than that, they buried everything. In that moment, the project of empire became a project of erasure. From the outside, Elizabeth's death was an end wrapped in dignity. The official statement announced her passing as peaceful, marked by a brief illness, and surrounded by loyal courtiers. In public sermons, she was called Gloriana, the fairy queen, the light that banished Catholic darkness, the virgin who gave herself wholly to England. Artists were commissioned to paint portraits of her as Diana, as Estrella, as the eternal mother of the realm. These images flooded the streets, the churches, the manuscripts, until the people no longer remembered the woman, only the mask. The theatre did not end with her life. In truth, it had only just begun. The council understood what was at stake. If Elizabeth had not been fully woman, if her body was marked by deformity, ambiguity, or monstrosity, then the legitimacy of every act she committed could be called into question. Every law, every proclamation, every treaty. If she had been replaced, as some whispered, then succession itself was a fraud. If her body was unnatural, cursed, or monstrous, then the victory over the Spanish Armada could be recast not as divine favor, but as demonic trickery. The Church of England, already fragile, could splinter. Protestantism, still fighting for credibility across Europe, could lose its holy champion. And most dangerously of all, the people could lose their faith in the crown as a symbol of divine order. So the choice was made not to explain, not to reframe, but to vanish the truth altogether. Records were rewritten. Personal diaries of court physicians disappeared. Payments to tailors were laundered through shadow accounts. Wardrobe inventories were scrubbed of any mention of modified garments, extra padding, or devices designed to hide changing anatomy. Testimonies from ladies-in-waiting were either confiscated or rewritten in more flattering hands. The room in which Elizabeth died was dismantled, its furniture burned, its flooring replaced. Every cloth, every comb, every trace of her body's final days was destroyed. The physicians who had attended her were given titles, pensions, and silence. Some disappeared into country estates. Others travelled abroad and never returned. The three who saw her body, Manningham, Snarkenborg, and the unnamed minister, were never allowed to speak again. They were each entombed in their own isolation, not dead, but erased. But what could not be erased? What haunted every stone of Westminster? Every whisper of the court was the unanswerable question: what had she been? It was not enough to lie. The lie had to be repeated so often, so beautifully, and so officially that it became more real than the truth. Elizabeth's funeral was designed not as a mourning, but as a coronation of myth. Her coffin, hidden beneath velvet and iron, was paraded through the streets by masked guards. No one was permitted to see her face. The mourners were kept far from the grave. The Archbishop of Canterbury gave a eulogy that made no mention of her body at all. Only her spirit, her purity, and her eternal rule. The words he repeated 3 times, as if casting a spell. She remains our sovereign, even in death. And then they sealed her in the Abbey, buried beneath a tomb designed to mislead, constructed with layers of lead and stone. Her resting place was encased in voids and metal shells that would later baffle radar scans and forensic historians. Inside, her coffin was placed in an outer sarcophagus, laced with mercury and bound in chains, markings not of veneration, but of containment. Religious symbols were etched not to honor her, but to ward off whatever might remain. No one before or since has been buried like Elizabeth Tudor. Not a monarch, not a saint, not even a sinner. Only she. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England, he did not touch the coffin. He did not open it. He did not move it. But his first royal acts were telling. He ordered the destruction of dozens of Elizabeth's personal letters. He burned transcripts of her medical examinations. He disbanded her inner circle and sent her most loyal servants away with generous pensions and legally binding oaths of silence. The woman he replaced had ruled for 45 years. Yet he refused to speak her name aloud in public, for more than a year after ascending the throne. Historians called it a political transition, but what it truly was containment. Even the Catholic Church, which had reviled Elizabeth during her life as a heretic and bastard, fell strangely silent after her death. No celebratory pamphlets, no denouncements of her soul, no declaration of victory over the Protestant Jezebel. Instead, nothing. Some scholars believe a secret agreement was struck between the Vatican and the English Crown's silence in exchange for the softening of anti-Catholic laws. Others believe the Church knew something it could not say aloud. Something so terrible that even their enemies were better left unshaken. And so began the age of enforced memory. Elizabeth was enshrined as the Virgin Queen, the paragon of feminine power, the symbol of national identity. Her image became currency, her words became scripture, her decisions became untouchable. But beneath that marble floor, sealed in a cage of lead and forgetting, her body remained contradicting it all. Generations would build empires atop that lie. Colonies would be founded, wars would be waged, churches would be built in her name. The myth of her body, a body perfect, sacred, and immutable, became the blueprint of the monarchy itself. Even Victoria, centurie later, would borrow her title Gloriana. Even Elizabeth II would walk in the echo of her myth. But none of them were asked to bear what the first Elizabeth had borne. None of them were made to carry a secret that could unmake a country, because the truth, once buried, was considered too dangerous to exhume. And even as historians dug for answers, the institutions she left behind refused to grant them access. Every request to open her tomb was denied. Every petition for scientific testing rejected. The reasons given were always the same: respect for the dead, preservation of the site, tradition. But those who had seen the radar scans, the irregular tomb architecture, the unexplained voids inside, knew better. The layers of lead, the lack of embalming, the absence of a death mask, the complete destruction of her final wardrobe. No other queen in history had died so completely. And yet, even now, she rules, not as woman, nor queen, but as idea, as mask, as myth. The crown she wore was never built for a head like hers. But she wore it anyway. She held it in place with pain and poison. She kept it upright as her flesh twisted. Her bones broke. Her blood darkened. And her identity dissolved. Because she knew perhaps more than anyone that the body of a monarch does not belong to the self. It belongs to history. And if history must be fed a lie to survive, then the lie must be beautiful enough to endure. Elizabeth gave England that lie, and England repaid her with silence. In the centre of Westminster Abbey, beneath slabs of blackened stone and centuries of dust, beneath Latin inscriptions carved in reverence and royal pride, there lies a silence more profound than any hymn ever sung in those vaulted halls. Beneath the alabaster effigy of a queen rests the coffin of Elizabeth Tudor, sealed in lead, entombed in mercury, bound in iron, and wrapped in one final unbroken truth that no one has ever dared to open it. 4 centuries have passed since the night her body was concealed from the eyes of the world. 4 centuries in which monarchs have come and gone, in which kings were beheaded, empires rose and fell, and scientific revolutions rewrote the very meaning of humanity. And yet, through all that time, the coffin of Elizabeth remains untouched, never moved, never opened, never examined, not once. The question is always the same: why? The official answer is comfortingly simple: tradition, dignity, respect for the dead. The tomb, they say, is a national monument, not a medical curiosity. But scratch beneath the surface of that explanation, and the contradictions multiply like cracks in a wall painted too many times. Other monarchs have been exhumed. Richard III was pulled from beneath a parking lot and laid out for global study. Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's greatest rival was relocated, reinterred, re-celebrated. Even Henry VIII, whose corpse exploded within its coffin, did not escape historical scrutiny. But Elizabeth remains sealed. Requests have been made, of course, quiet ones at first, then louder, more formal, backed by scientists, historians, even government petitions. Each time, they are denied. The stated reasons vary: concerns for conservation, fears of public spectacle, logistical constraints, but always, behind the polite bureaucratic language, one can feel the pressure of something deeper, not just a body being protected, but a myth, a structure of belief so foundational that disturbing it would not only rattle bones, but shake empires. What are they afraid we might find? What is it about that coffin that still demands such vigilance? Some dismiss the question as conspiracy historians clinging to whispers, YouTubers chasing shadows. But the evidence, however fragmented, does not disappear. The anomalies are real. Ground-penetrating radar scans have revealed multiple layers within the tomb's architecture, unusual voids, secondary chambers, sealed compartments filled with dense material consistent with lead and mercury. These are not normal burial features. The layout of Elizabeth's tomb is unlike that of any other sovereign promontory. It is not a monument. It is a vault. And within that vault lies a corpse that no one has ever seen. There is no embalming record, no official post-mortem, no written description of the Queen's final state, save for sanitized lines. About serenity and dignity, there is no death mask, no autopsy sketch, no burial garments on public display. Every object associated with her final days has been lost, destroyed, or quietly tucked away in inaccessible archives. Even the bed she died on was dismantled plank by plank, and the three people who prepared her body, one physician, one lady in waiting, one cleric, were never seen again. Their silence became the blueprint for the silence that followed. Elizabeth's reign was mythologized with terrifying precision. Her portraits were repainted until her image became eternal, unaging. Her words were repeated until they echoed like scripture. Her body rotting, twisted, and possibly inhuman was never mentioned again. The Virgin Queen became a divine abstraction, a figure outside time, a symbol that could be held up against foreign threats, religious doubt, even domestic unrest. She was purity without flaw, strength without sin, womanhood without danger. But that symbol was made of poisoned flesh, and it is still down there, preserved perfectly, perhaps within its layers of lead and secrecy waiting. Imagine, for a moment, that the tomb was opened. What would they find? Would the remains support the tale that has been passed down for generations, a slender skeleton? A woman's pelvis? A monarch whose age and illness simply overtook her? Or would the truth bleed out like oil from a split stone? What if the body is deformed? What if the skeleton bears not the hallmarks of a human woman, but of something between sexes or beyond them? What if the second heart is still there, mummified in its own cavity? What if the tumours remain, complete with teeth and hair, and the impossible structures first whispered in the writings of Dr. Manningham? What if the blood, even after all these years, still carries a composition unlike anything recorded in medicine? And what if the bones themselves have changed horns, scales, ridges, ossifications that science cannot explain? Could we still call her queen? Could we still call her human? The fear is not just in what the body might reveal, but in what that revelation would demand of us. History is not just memory. It is foundation. It tells us who we are. Elizabeth stands at the root of the English national identity. Her reign marks the beginning of empire, of naval power, of the Protestant ascendancy. She is the reason the monarchy survived. She is the reason Shakespeare wrote. She is the mother of modern Britain. If she was not what she claimed to be, if she was neither woman nor virgin nor even fully human, then what does that say about everything that followed? How many decisions did she make? How many laws did she sign? How many generations were shaped by her word? If the sovereign body was false, what does that make of the sovereignty? These are not questions a nation wants to ask. So they do not. The tomb remains closed. The myths remain polished. The stories remain safe. But beneath that stone, nothing has changed. The lead is still wrapped around her. The mercury still floods her second shell. The bones, if bones they still are, lie in patterns that deny scripture, medicine, and monarchy. And if the tomb were ever opened, if modern instruments touched what lies beneath, there would be no unseeing what is found. The Virgin Queen would be unmasked. The lie would die, and the crown, perhaps, would tremble. So we tell ourselves, it is better this way. Better not to know. Better to leave her untouched, undisturbed, unmoved. We call it respect, but it is fear. Elizabeth once said, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." History remembers this as metaphor. But what if it wasn't? What if that body was never hers to begin with? What if the truth of who she was, what she was not weakness, but something so alien, so unbearable, that no kingdom could survive its confession? What if the Queen who ruled England for 45 years, who defied popes and armies, who stood at the threshold of empire, was not a miracle of will and politics, but a warning? The body that lies in Westminster Abbey may still carry that warning, not just in its mutations, but in its silence, because the final truth of Elizabeth Tudor is not in what she was blank, it is in what she became, and in what she made the world believe.